So, how are you guys doing this evening? I hope you've had a good week. Is my mic loud enough? Because I've been trying to get it set because I was realizing how quiet my pickup was last week when I was working on the VODs. Click, 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 click. Let's see. That's not what I wanted. Of course, I'm still fighting with the computer to get sound alerts to go the right place. And of course that cut off. Is my fan really that loud, or is it just my microphone saying that it is? Okay, sound alerts are working. At least I hear it. Okay. After this last OBS update, I've been having to fix settings on everything. Because that's just what OBS do. And there is news. I don't know if you guys follow close enough on things I'm tagged in, but apparently I want a new model. So that'll be coming eventually. I also got new character artwork, which will also be cool. I'm apparently getting an update of my current wardrobe. And I was asking about it to see how hard it was to get more outfits, and I gotta do the new computer thing first before I even think about doing any further upgrades. And as far as the new computer goes, I guess I've technically paid for half of it so far. I haven't gotten enough money for half of it, but credit cards. And I've been trying to make sure everything I buy for it has been on sale. So hopefully streams might improve. It'd be really cool if I get everything done for my anniversary. Of course, that's not really until, well, if I go by my actual streaming start, it's a little over 2 weeks, well, less than 2 weeks away. So I believe I started August 11th of 2021. I didn't get affiliate until December of 2022. But hey, that's just progress. No announcements when the animated series with me narrating fairy tales. Oh. That's the pipe dream. I'd really love to do the animated stories, but I don't think I'll ever get the sponsorship for that kind of thing, no matter how well I can storyboard things. Because I can't draw characters, but I can draw storyboards. Just like I storyboarded my introduction. The whole illustration of walking into the thing and then turning around and then coming into the scene. I storyboarded that. And then I screenshot animated it. Because I can't draw worth a damn. I can color. So if I needed to color things, I could. And I'm really concerned about the new phone that I had to get, because my new phone does not want to connect to my computer so far as VTube Studio goes. So I'm using my old phone for my VTube Studio capture, which of course means it's sluggish anyway. Because, you know, not the best camera, but it works. But anyway, it is already 9:11, so I'm already late for starting the story. So, let us go to the study. Boop. And I'm in the wrong place again. Luckily, I left myself mobile. Anyway, we are continuing with The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. And I believe tonight's two stories are still ones written by Arthur Conan Doyle that are not Sherlock Holmes, but they definitely read as his writing. Let's see, this would be the Round of Fire series. Huh. Well, that first story's not exceptional. Oh, it's 11 pages. Second one is 14. I might get 3 stories. We'll see how it goes. I also have a minor storm trying to start it outside. But unless power goes out, the show will go on. And I need to get in my seat properly, because I am really close to the screen. That's odd. Headpads are on, you know, if you want to give me headpads or something like that. But, you know, it's not required or anything. And just again, microphone test. You guys can hear me fine and everything, right? I'm normally reading like this, and my mouth is not facing my microphone, but I've adjusted my microphone, and I've adjusted my microphone volume, and honestly, stories just need to be heard. Oh, let me check something, because I'm not hearing the fireplace. Because the fireplace is showing ads. Wow, that's lovely. Okay. Fireplace is good. Okay. As long as you can hear the stories, we're doing good. That's why we're here. We're here for stories. And for the love and support of our friends. So everyone sit back, relax, or do what you need to do. Drink, medicate, hydrate, and we'll get into the stories. First story tonight has an interesting title. Anyway, again by Arthur Conan Doyle, Round the Fire, Story 5, The Story of the Black Doctor. Bishop's Crossing is a small village lying 10 miles in a southwesterly direction from Liverpool. Here in the early 70s, there settled a doctor named Lanzas Lana. Nothing was known locally either of his anecdotes or of the reasons which had prompted him to come to this Lancashire hamlet. 2 facts only were certain about him. The one that he had gained his medical qualification with some distinction at Glasgow, and the other that he came undoubtedly of a tropical race, and was so dark that he might almost have been a stain of Indian in his complexion. His predominant features were, however, European, and he possessed a stately courtesy in his carriage which suggested a Spanish extraction. A swarthy-skinned raven, black hair, and sparkling dark eyes under a pair of heavily tufted brows made a strange contrast to the flaxen and chestnut rustics of England, and the newcomer was soon known as the Black Doctor of Bishop's Crossing. At first, it was a term of ridicule and reproach. As the years went on, it became a title of honor which was familiar to the whole countryside, and extended far beyond the narrow confines of the village. For the newcomer proved himself to be a capable surgeon and an accomplished physician. The practice of a distinct had been in the hands of Edward Roe, and son of Sir William Roe, the Liverpool consultant, but he had not inherited the talents of his father, and Dr. Lana, with his advantages of presence and of manner, soon beat him out of the field. Dr. Lana's social success was rapidly as his professional. A remarkable surgical case of the Honourable James Lowry, the second son of Lord Belton, was the means of introducing him to the country society, where he became a favourite, though the charm of his conversation and elegance of his manners. The absence of antecedents and of relatives is sometimes an aid rather than an impediment to social advancement, and the distinguished individuality of this handsome doctor was its own recommendation. His patients had one fault, and one fault only, to find in him. He appeared to be a confirmed bachelor. This was more remarkable since the house which he occupied was a large one, and it was known that his success in practice had enabled him to save considerable sums. At first, the local matchmakers were continually coupling his name with one or other of the eligible ladies, but as years passed and Dr. Luna remained unmarried, it came to be generally understood that for some reason he must remain a bachelor. Some even went so far as to assent that he was already married, and that it was in order to escape the consequence of an early misalliance that he had buried himself at Bishop's Crossing. And then, just as the matchmakers had finally given him up in despair, an engagement was suddenly announced to Miss Frances Morton of Leigh Hall. Miss Morton was a young lady who was well known upon the countryside. Her father, James Hadlin Morton, having been the squire of Bishop's Crossing. Both her parents were, however, dead, and she lived with her only brother, Arthur Morton, who had inherited the family estate. In person, Miss Morton was tall and stately, and she was famous for her quick, impetuous nature and her strength of character. She met Dr. Lana at a garden party, and a friendship was quickly ripened into love, sprang up between them. Nothing could exceed their devotion to each other. There was some discrepancy in of age, him being 37 and she 24, but save in that one aspect, there was no possible objection to be found with match. The engagement was in February, and it was arranged that the marriage should take place in August. Upon the 3rd of June, Dr. Lana received a letter from abroad. In a small village, the postmaster is also in a position to be the gossip master, and Mr. Blankley of Bishop's Crossing had many of his secrets and his neighbors in his possession. Of this particular letter he remarked only that it was a curious envelope, that it was in a man's handwriting, and the postscript was Buenos Aires, and the stamp of Argentine Republic. It was the first letter which had been ever known Miss Dr. Lana had to receive from abroad, and this was the reason why his attention was particularly called to it before he handed it to the local postman. It was delivered the evening delivery of that date. Next morning, that is, upon the 4th of June, Dr. Lana called upon Miss Morton, and a long interview followed, from which he was observed to return in a state of great agitation. Miss Morton remained in her room all that day, and her maid found her several times in tears. In the course of a week, it was an open secret to the whole village that the engagement was at an end, that Dr. Lana had behaved shamefully to the young lady, and that Arthur Morton, her brother, was taking of horsewhipping to him. In what particular respect the doctor had behaved badly was unknown. Some surmised one thing and some another, but it was observed and taken as an obvious sign of a guilty conscience that he would go for miles round rather than pass the windows of Leigh Hall, and that he gave up attending morning service at Sundays, where he might have met the young lady. There was an advertisement also in there that, as to the sale of the practice which mentioned no names, but which was thought by some to refer to Bishop's Crossing, and to mean that Dr. Lana was thinking of abandoning the scene of his success. Such was the position of affairs when, upon the evening of Monday, June 21st, there came a fresh development which changed what had been a mere village scandal to a tragedy which arrested the attention of the whole nation. Some detail is necessary to cause the facts of that evening to present their full significance. The sole occupants of the doctor's house were his housekeeper, an elderly and most respectable woman named Martha Woods, and a young servant, Mary Pilling. The coachman and the surgery boy slept out. It was the custom of the doctor to sit at night in his study, which was next to surgery in the wing of the house, which was farthest from the servants' quarters. This side of the house had a door of its own and the convenience of patients, so that it was possible for the doctor to admit and receive a visitor without the knowledge of anyone. As a matter of fact, when patients came late, it was quite usual for him it was quite usual for him to let them in and out by the surgery entrance, for the maid and the housekeeper were in the habit of retiring early. On this particular night, Martha Woods went in the doctor's study at 9:30 and found him writing at his desk. She bade him good night, sent for the maid to bed, and then occupied herself until 11:15 in household matters. It was striking 11 upon the hall clock when she went to her own room. She had been there about a quarter of an hour to 20 minutes when she heard a cry or call, which appeared to come from within the house. She waited some time, but it was not repeated. Much alarmed, for the sound was large and urgent, she put on a dressing gown and ran out at her top speed to the doctor's study. "Who's there?" cried a voice as she tapped at the door. "I'm here, sir. Mrs. Woods." "I beg that you will leave me in peace. Go back to your room this instant," cried the voice, which was, to the best of her belief, that of her master. The tone was so harsh and so unlike her master's usual manner that she was surprised and a bit hurt. "I thought I heard you calling, sir," she explained, but no answer was given to her. Mrs. Woods looked at the clock as she returned to her room, and it was 11:30. At some period between 11 and 12, she could not be positive as to the exact hour, a patient called upon the doctor and was unable to get any reply from him. This late visitor was Miss Manning, wife of the village grocer, who was dangerously ill with typhoid fever. Dr. Lana had asked her to look in the last thing and let him know how her husband was progressing. She observed the light was burning in the study, but having knocked several times at the surgery door without response, she concluded that the doctor had been called out, and so she returned home. There is a short, winding drive with a lamp at the end of it leading down from the home to the road. As Mrs. Madden, emerging from the gate, a man was coming along the footpath. Thinking that it might be Dr. Lana returning from some professional visit, she waited for him, and was surprised to see that it was Mr. Arthur Morton, the young squire. In the light of the lamp, she observed that his manner was excited, and that he carried in his hand a heavy hunting crop. He was turning in at the gate when she addressed him. "The doctor's not in, sir," said she. "How do you know that?" he asked harshly. "I've been to the surgery door, sir." "I see a light," said the young squire, looking up the drive. "That is in his study, is it not?" "Yes, sir, but I'm sure that he's gone out." "Well, he must come in again," said young Morton, and passed through the gate while Mrs. Madden went upon her way homeward. At 3 o'clock that morning, her husband suffered a sharp relapse, and she was so alarmed by his symptoms that she determined to call the doctor without delay. As she passed through the gate, she was surprised to see someone lurking among the laurel bushes. It was certainly a man, and to her best of her belief, Mr. Morton Arthur. Preoccupied with her own troubles, she gave no particular attention to the incident and hurried on upon her errand. When she reached the house, she perceived to her surprise that the light was still burning in the study. She therefore tapped on the surgery door. There was no answer. She repeated the knocking several times without effect. It appeared to her to be unlikely that the doctor would either go to bed or go out without turning such a bright light behind. And it struck Mrs. Manning that it was possible that he might have dropped asleep in his chair. She tapped at the study window, therefore, but without result. Then, finding that there was an opening between the curtain and the woodwork, she looked through. The small room was brightly lighted from the large lamp on the center table, which was littered with the doctor's books and instruments. No one was visible, nor did she see anything unusual, except that the further shadow thrown on the table, a dingy white glove, was lying upon the carpet. And then suddenly her eyes became more accustomed to the light. A boot emerged from the other end of the shadow, and she realized, with a thrill of horror, that what she had taken to be a glove was the hand of a man who was prostrate upon the floor. Understanding that something terrible had occurred, she rang at the front door, roused Mrs. Woods, the housekeeper, and the two women made their way into the study, having first dispatched the maidservants to the police station. At the side of the table, away from the window, Dr. Lana was discovered stretched upon his back and quite dead. It was evident that he had been subjected to violence, for one of his eyes was blackened, and there were marks of bruises on his face and neck. A slight thickening and swelling of his features appeared to suggest that the cause of death had been strangulation. He was dressed in his usual professional clothes, but wore cloth slippers and soles of which were perfectly clean. The carpet was marked all over, especially on the side of the door, with traces of dirty boots, which were presumably left by the murderer. It was evident that someone had entered by the surgery door, killed the doctor, and then made his escape unseen. That the assailant was a man was certain, from the size of the footprints and from the nature of the injuries, but beyond that point the police found it very difficult to go. There were no signs of robbery, and the doctor's gold watch was safe in his pocket. He kept a heavy cash box in the room, and this was discovered to be locked, but empty. Mrs. Woods had the impression that a large sum of money was usually kept there, but the doctor had paid a heavy corn bill in cash only that very day, and was conjectured that it was not the robber of the emptiness of the box that was due. One thing in the room was missing, but that one thing suggestive. The portrait of Miss Morton, which had always stood upon the side table, had been taken from its frame and carried off. Mrs. Woods has observed it there when she waited upon her employer that evening, and now it was gone. On the other hand, there was picked up from the floor a green eye patch, which the housekeeper could not remember to have seen before. Such a patch, however, might have been the possession of the doctor, and there was nothing to indicate that it was in any way connected to the crime. Suspicion could only lead in one direction, and Arthur Morton, the young esquire, was immediately arrested. The evidence against him was circumstantial, but damning. He was devoted to his sister, and it was shown that since the rupture between her and Dr. Lana had been heard again and again to express himself in the most vindictive terms towards his former lawyer. He had, as stated, been somewhere about 11 o'clock entering the doctor's drive with a hunting crop in hand. He had then, according to the theory of the police, broken in upon the doctor, whose exclamation of fear or anger had been loud enough to attract the attention of Mrs. Woods. When Mrs. Woods descended, Dr. Lana had made up his mind to talk it over with the visitor, and had therefore sent his housekeeper back to her room. This conversation had lasted a long time and become more and more fiery, and had ended by a personal struggle in which the doctor lost his life. The fact revealed by a post-mortem, that his heart was much diseased, an ailment quite unsuspected during his life, would make it possible that death might, in this case, ensue from injuries which would not have been fatal to a healthy man. Arthur Morton then had removed his sister's photograph and had made his way homeward, stepping aside into the laurel bush to avoid Mrs. Madden at the gate. This was the theory of the prosecution, and the case which they presented was a formidable one. On the other hand, there were some strong defenses for the point. Morton was high-spirited and impetuous like his sister, but he was respected and liked by everyone, and his frank and honest nature seems to be incapable of such a crime. His own explanation was that he was anxious to have a conversation with Dr. Lena about some urgent family matters. From first to last, he refused to even mention the name of his sister. He did not attempt to deny that this conversation would probably have been an unpleasant one. He heard from the patients that the doctor was out, and he therefore waited until about 3 in the morning for his return. But as he had seen nothing of him to that hour, he had given up and had returned home. As to his death, he knew no more about it than the constable who arrested him. He had formerly been an intimate friend of the deceased man, but circumstances which he would prefer not to mention had brought about a change of his sentiments. There were several facts which supported his innocence. It was certain that Dr. Lena was alive and in his study at 11:30. Mrs. Woods had prepared to swear that it was his voice that she had heard at that hour. The friends of the prisoner contended that it was possible that, at the time, Dr. Lena was not alone. The sound which had originally attracted the attention of the housekeeper, and her master's unusual impatience that she should leave him in peace, seems to be on that point. If this were so, then it appeared to be probable that he had met his end between the moment when the housekeeper heard his voice and the time when Mrs. Moulding made her first call, and found it impossible to attract his attention. But if this were the time of death, then it was certain that Mr. Arthur Morton could not be guilty, as it was far after this that she had met the young squire at the gate. If this hypothesis were correct, and someone was with Dr. Lena before Mrs. Madden and Mr. Arthur Morton, then who was this someone, and what motives had he for wishing evil to the doctor? It was universally admitted that if the friends of the accused could throw some light upon this, they would have gone a long way towards establishing his innocence. But in the meanwhile, it was open to the public to say, as they did say, that there was no proof that anyone had been there at all except the young squire, while, on the other hand, there was ample proof that his motives in going were of a sinister kind. When Mrs. Madden called, the doctor might have retired to his room, or he might, as she thought at the time, have gone out and returned afterwards to find Mr. Arthur Morton waiting for him. Some of the supporters of the accused laid stress upon the fact that the photograph of his sister Frances, which had been removed from the doctor's room, had not been found in her brother's possession. This argument, however, did not count for much, as he had ample time before his arrest to burn it or to destroy it. As for the only positive evidence in the case, the muddy footprints upon the floor, they were so blurred by the softness of the carpet that it was impossible to make any trustworthy deduction from them. The most that could be said was that their appearance was not inconsistent with the theory that they were made by the accused, and it was further shown that his boots were very muddy upon that night. There had been a heavy shower in the afternoon, and all boots were probably in the same condition. Such a bold statement of the singular and romantic interest of events which centered the public attention upon this Lancaster tragedy. The unknown origin of the doctor, his curious and distinguished personality, the position of the man who was accused of the murder, and the love affair which had preceded the crime, all combined to make the affair one of those dramas that absorbs the whole interest of a nation. Throughout the 3 kingdoms, men discussed the case of the Black Doctor of Bishop's Crossing, and many were the theories put forward to explain the facts. But it may safely be said that among all of them, not one which prepared the minds of the public to the extraordinary sequel, which caused so much excitement upon the first day of the trial, and came to climax upon the second. The long files of the Lancaster Weekly with a report of the case lie before me as I write, but I must content myself with a synopsis of the case up to the point which, upon the evening of the first day, the evidence of Miss Frances Morton threw a singular new light upon the case. Mr. Porlock Carr, the counsel for the prosecution, had marshaled his facts with his usual skill, and as the day wore on, it became more and more evident how difficult was the task of Mr. Humphrey, who had been retained for the defense, had before him. Several witnesses were put up to swear for the temperament expressions of the young squire, and had been utter a word about the doctor, and the fiery manner in which he resented the alleged ill treatment of his sister. Mrs. Madden, repeating her evidence as to the visits which had been paid late in the night by the prisoner to the deceased, and it was shown by another witness that the prisoner was aware that the doctor was in the habit of sitting up alone in the isolated wing of his house, and that he had chosen this very late hour to call because he knew that the victim would be at his mercy. A servant of the squire's house was compelled to admit that he had heard his master return about 3 that morning, which corroborated Mrs. Madden's statement that she had seen him among laurel bushes near the gate upon her occasion of the second visit. The muddy boots and the alleged similarity of the footprints were duly dwelt upon, and it was felt when the case was for the prosecution had been presented, however circumstantial it might be. It was none the less so complete and so convincing that the fate of the prisoner was sealed, unless something quite unexpected should be disclosed by the defense. It was 3 o'clock when the prosecution closed. At 4:30, when the case rose, a new and unlooked-for development had occurred. I extract the incident, or part of it, from the journal which I have already mentioned, omitting the preliminary observations of the counsel. Considerable sensation was caused in the crowded court when the first witness called for the defense proved to be Miss Frances Morton, the sister of the prisoner. Our readers will remember that the young lady had been engaged to Dr. Lena, and that it was his anger over the sudden termination of this engagement which was thought to have driven her brother to the perpetration of this crime. Miss Morton had not, however, been directly implicated in the case in any way, at either the inquest or at the police court proceedings, and her appearance as a leading witness for the defense came as a surprise to the public. Miss Frances Morton, who was a tall and handsome brunette, gave her evidence in the low but clear voice, though it was evident throughout that she was suffering from extreme emotion. She alluded to her engagement to the doctor, touched briefly upon his termination, which was due, she said, to personal matters connected to his family, and surprised the court by asserting that she had always considered her brother's resentments to be unreasonable and intemperate. In answer to a direct question from her counsel, she replied that she did not feel that she had any grievance whatever against Dr. Lena, and that in her opinion he had acted in a perfectly honorable manner. Her brother, on an insufficient knowledge of the facts, had taken another view, and she was compelled to acknowledge that, in spite of her entreaties, he had uttered threats of personal violence against the doctor, and had, upon the evening of the tragedy, announced his intention of having it out with him. She had done her best to bring him to a more reasonable frame of mind, but he was very headstrong where his emotions and prejudices were concerned. Up to the point, the young lady's evidence had appeared to make against the prisoner rather than in his favor. The questions of her counsel, however, soon put a different light upon the matter, and disclosed an unexpected line of defense. "Mr. Humphrey, do you believe you're guilty as brother of this crime?" The judge: "I cannot permit that question." Mr. Humphrey: We are here to decide upon the questions of the fact, not the belief. Mr. Humphrey, do you know that your brother is not guilty of the death of Dr. Lana? Miss Martin. Yes. Mr. Humphrey, how do you know it? Miss Morton. Because Dr. Lana is not dead. Pausing for dramatic effect. And to get rid of the bot. There followed a prolonged cessation of the court, which interrupted the cross-examination of the witness. Hi, Matsu. Mr. Humphrey, how do you know, Miss Morton, that Dr. Lana is not dead? Miss Morton. Because I've received a letter from him since the date of his supposed death. Mr. Humphrey, how have you received this letter? Miss Morton. Yes, but I should prefer not to show it. Mr. Humphrey. Have you the envelope? Miss Morton. Yes, it is here. What is the postmark? Liverpool. And the date? June the 22nd. That being the day after his alleged death, are you prepared to swear to his handwriting, Miss Morton? Certainly. I am prepared to call 6 other witnesses, my lord, to testify that this letter is in the writing of Dr. Lana. Judge, that you must call them tomorrow. Mr. Porletcar, counsel for the prosecution. In the meantime, my lord, we claim possession of this document so that we may obtain expert evidence as how far it is an imitation of the handwriting of the gentleman whom we shall confidently assert is deceased. I need not point out that the theory is so unexpectedly sprung upon us that it may prove to be a very obvious device adopted by the friends of the prisoner in order to divert this inquiry. I would draw attention to the fact that the young lady must, according to her own account, have possessed this letter during the proceedings at the inquest and the police court. She desires us to believe that she permitted these to proceed, although she held in her pockets evidence which would at any moment have brought them to an end. Can you explain this, Miss Morton? Dr. Lana desired his secret to be preserved. Then why have you now made this present? To save my brother. A murmur of sympathy broke out in the court, which was instantly suppressed by the judge. Admitting this line of defense, it lies with you, Mr. Humphrey, to throw a light upon who this man whose body has been recognized by so many friends and patients of Dr. Lana as being that of the doctor himself. Andre. Has anyone up to now expressed any doubt about the matter? Not to my knowledge. We hope to make the matter clear. Then the court adjourns until tomorrow. This new development in the case excited the utmost interest among the general public. Press comments was preserved by the fact that the trial was until undecided, but the question was everywhere argued as to how far the truth in Miss Morton's declaration, and how far it might be a daring ruse for the purpose of saving her brother. The obvious dilemma was missing the doctor, that there was an extraordinary chance that he was not dead. Then he must be held responsible for the death of this unknown man who resembled him so exactly, and who was found in his study. This letter, which Miss Morton refused to produce, was possibly a confession of guilt, and she might find herself in terrible position of only being able to save her brother from the gallows by the sacrifice of her former lover. The court next morning was crammed to overflowing, and a murmur of excitement passed over it when Mr. Humphrey was observed to enter in a state of emotion which even his trained nerves could not conceal, and to confer with the opposing counsel. A few hurried words which were left a look of amazement upon Mr. Porlock Carr's face, passed between them, and then the counsel for the defense, addressing the judge, announced that, with the consent of the prosecution, the young lady who had given evidence upon the sitting would not be recalled. But you appear, Mr. Humphrey, to have left matters in a very unsatisfactory state. Perhaps, my lord, my next witness may clear them up. Then call your next witness. I call Dr. Lanzaslana. The learned counsel has made many telling remarks in this day, but it was certainly never produced in such a sensation with so short a sentence. The court was simply stunned with amazement as the very man whose fate had been the subject of so much contention appeared bodily before them in the witness box. Those among spectators who had known him at Bishop's Crossing saw him now gaunt and thin, with deep lines of care upon his face. But in spite of his melancholy bearing and despondent expression, there were few who could say that they ever seen a man more distinguished presence. Bowing to the judge, he asked if he might be allowed to make a statement, and having been duly informed that whatever he said might be used against him, he bowed once more and proceeded. My wish, he said, is to hold nothing back, but to tell with perfect frankness all that occurred upon the night of the 21st of June. I had that known the incidents had suffered, and that so much trouble had been brought upon those whom I love best in the world, I should have come forward long ago, but there were reasons which prevented these things from coming to my ears. It is my desire that an unhappy man should vanish from the world which was known him, but I had not foreseen that others would be affected by my actions. Let me, to the best of my ability, repair the evil which I have done. To anyone who is acquainted with the history of Argentine Republic, the name Lana is well known. My father, who came of the best blood of old Spain, filled all the highest offices in the state, and would have been president but for his death in the riots at San Juan. A brilliant career might have been my own to my own twin brother Ernest, and myself had not been for financial losses which made it necessary that we should earn our own living. I apologize, sir, if these details appear to be irrelevant, but they are a necessary introduction to what is to follow. I had, as I have said, a twin brother named Ernest, whose resemblance to me is so great that even when we were together, people would see no difference between us. Down to the smallest detail, we were exactly the same. As we grew older, the likeness became less marked because our expression was the same, but with our features and slight repose of points in difference were very, indeed, slight. It does not become me to say too much of one who is dead, but the more so that he is my only brother, and I believe his character to be to those who knew him best. I will only say, for I have to say it, that in my early manhood I conceived horror of him, and that I, for good reason, with the aversion which filled me. My own reputation suffered from his actions, for our close resemblance caused me to be credited with many of them. Eventually, in a particularly disgraceful business, he contrived to throw the whole damn odium upon me in such a way that I was forced to leave the Argentine forever and to seek a career in Europe. The freedom from his hatred presence more than compensated me for the loss of my native land. I had enough money to defray my medical studies at Glasgow, and finally settled in practice at Bishop's Crossing, in the firm conviction that, in remote Lancashire hamlet, I should never hear from him again. For years my hopes were fulfilled, and then at last he discovered me. Some Liverpool man who visited Buenos Aires put him upon my track. He had lost all his money and thought that he would come over to share mine. Knowing my horror of him, he rightfully thought I would be willing to buy him off. I received a letter from him saying that he was coming. It was a crisis in my own affairs, and his arrival might conceivably bring trouble, and even my disgrace, upon those whom I especially bound to shield from anything of the kind. I took steps to ensure that my evil which might come should fall upon me only at that. Here he turned and looked at the prisoner. It was the cause of my conduct upon my part which was too harshly judged. My only motive was to screen those who were dear to me from any possible connection with disgrace and scandal. That scandal and disgrace would come with my brother was only to say that he would again. My brother arrived himself one night very long after my receipt of the letter, and I was sitting in my study after the servants had gone to bed when I heard a footstep upon the gravel outside, and an instant later I saw his face looking at me through the window. He was a clean-shaven man like myself, and that the resemblance between us was so great that for an instant I thought it was my own reflection in the glass. He had a dark patch over his eye, but our features were absolutely the same. Then he smiled in a sardonic way which had been the trick of his from boyhood. I knew that he was the same brother who had driven me from my native land and brought disgrace upon what had been an honorable name. I went to the door and admitted him. That would be about 10 o'clock that night. When he came into the glare of the lamp, I saw at once that he had fallen upon very evil days. He had walked from Liverpool, and he was still tired and ill. I was quite shocked by the expression upon his face. My medical knowledge told me that there was already some serious internal malady. He had been drinking also, for his face was bruised as a result of the scuffle from which he had come with some sailors. It was to cover his injured eye that he wore this patch, which he removed when he entered the room. He was himself dressed in a pea jacket and flannel shirt, and his feet were bruised through his boots. But his poverty had only made him more savagely vindictive towards me. His hatred rose to the height of mania. I had been rolling the money in England, and according to his account, while he had been starving in South Africa. I cannot describe to you the threats he was uttered or the results which he poured upon me. My impression is that hardships and debauchery had unhinged his reason. He paced about the room like a wild beast, demanding money, and all in the foulest language. I am a hot-tempered man, but I thank God that I am able to say that I have remained master of myself, and that I never raised a hand against him. My coolness only irritated him more. He raved, he cursed, he shook his fist in my face, and then suddenly a horrible spasm passed over his features, and he clasped my hand to his side. With a loud cry, he fell in a sharp heap at my feet. I raised him up and stretched him upon my sofa, but no answer came from my exclamations, and the hand which I had held in mine was cold and clammy. His diseased heart had broken down. His own violence had killed him. For a long time I sat as if I were in some dreadful dream, staring at the body of my brother. I was roused by the knocking of Mrs. Woods, who had been disturbed by the dying cry. I sent her away to bed. Shortly afterwards a patient tapped at my surgery door, but I took no notice, and he or she went off again. Slowly and gradually I sat there. A plan was forming itself in my head as a curious, automatic way in which plans to form. When I rose from my chair, my future movements were finally decided upon without my being conscious of any thought process. It was instinct to irresistibly inclined me towards the course. Ever since that change in my affairs which I had alluded, Bishop's Crossing had become hateful to me. My plans of life had been ruined, and I had met with a hasty judgment and unkind treatment where I expected sympathy. It was true that the danger of my scandal for my brother had passed away with his life, but still, I was sore about the past and felt that things could never have been what they had been. It may be I was duly insensitive, and that I did not make sufficient allowance for others, but my feelings were as I describe. Any chance of getting away from Bishop's Crossing, and of everyone in it, would be welcome to me. And here was such a chance as I could never have dared to hope for. A chance which would enable me to make a clean break of the past. There was this dead man lying upon my sofa, so like me that save for a little thickness and coarseness of the features, there was no difference at all. No one had seen him come, and no one would miss him. We were both clean-shaven, and his hair was the same length as my own. If I changed my clothes with him, then Dr. Alonus Lana would be found lying dead in his study, and there would be an end of an unfortunate fellow and of a blighted career. There was plenty of ready money in the room, and I could carry away with me and help me start once more when I was in another land. In my brother's clothes I could walk by night unobserved as far as Liverpool, and then at the great seaport I would soon find some means of leaving the country. After my lost hopes, an humbled existence where I was unknown was far preferable to the estimation of practice, however successful in Bishop's Crossing, where any moment I might come face to face with those whom I should wish, if it were possible, to forget. I determined to effect the chase. And I did so. I will not go into particulars, for the recollection is painful as the experience, but an hour my brother lay, dressed down to the smallest detail in my clothes, while I slunk out by the surgery door. And taking the back path which led across some fields, I started off to make my best of the way to Liverpool, where I arrived the same night. My bag of money and my certain portrait were all I carried out of the house, and I left behind me in a hurry the shade which my brother had been wearing over his eye. Everything else of his I took with me. I give you my word, sir, that never one instant did the idea occur to me that the people might think that I had been murdered, nor did I imagine that anyone might be caused serious danger by the stratagem by which I endeavored to gain a fresh world in the start. On the contrary, it was the thought of relieving others of the burden of my presence which was always utmost in my mind. A sailing vessel was leaving Liverpool for that very day to Corunna, and in this I took my passage, thinking that my voyage would give me time to recover my balance, and to consider my future. But before I left, my resolution had softened. I bethought me of that one person in the world to whom I would not cause an hour of sadness. She would mourn for me in her heart, however harsh and unsympathetic her relatives might be. She understood and appreciated the motives upon which I acted, and if the rest of her family condemned me, she, at least, would not forget. And so I sent her a note under the seal of secrecy to give her unbaseless grief. If under the pressure of events she broke that seal, she has my entire sympathy and forgiveness. It was only last night that I returned to England, and during all that time I have heard nothing of the sensation which my supposed death had caused, nor of the accusation that Mr. Arthur Morton had been concerned with. It was late evening in the paper that I read the account of the proceedings of yesterday, and I have come this morning as fast as an express train could bring me to testify to the truth. Such was a remarkable statement of Dr. Alonus Lana, which was brought to the trial to the sudden termination. The subsequent investigation corroborated it to find the extending of the vessel in which his brother Lana had come over from South America. The ship's doctor was able to testify that he had complained of a weak heart during the voyage, and that his symptoms were consistent with such a death as described. As to Dr. Alonus Lana, he returned to the village from which he had made his dramatic disappearance, and a complete reconciliation was effected between him and the young squire, the latter having acknowledged that he had entirely misunderstood the other's motives in withdrawing from the engagements. That another reconciliation followed may be judged from the notice extracted from a prominent column in the Morning Post. The marriage was solemnized on September 19th by the Reverend Stephen Johnson at the parish church of Bishop's Crossing between Alonsus Xavier Lana, son of Don Alfredo Lana, formerly foreign minister of the Argentine Republic, and Frances Morton, only daughter of the late James Morton, J.P., of Lay Hall, Bishop's Crossing, Lancashire. Oh. And I fumbled around a lot in that one. Yes, welcome in, Matsu. And thank you for the hydrates. Oh. You would have expected a twin brother being involved in that one. Oh, up until the point that she said he wasn't dead. Ah, there was a Gumi. I didn't even see it. Oh well. And congrats on getting second, Taka. Okay, if the ads haven't run yet, they probably will soon. So I'm going to go ahead and make them go. And then we'll get into the second story. Cool? Cool. Those of you who are subscribers, well, hang around. Why do I not have the 3-minute? Never mind. Honestly, that was timing. Here I am looking for the thing to start the ads, and the ads start themselves. Ugh. So again, I hope everyone's had a really good week. I know it's only Thursday, and we've only got a couple of days left, but I hope you're having a good one anyway. Oh, I am one person away from 350 followers? I did not know that. I really don't pay attention. Not that I really have anything planned for 350. Yeah. I'm going to hydrate again, though. So when I was doing the different voices in the courtyard, it was actually written almost as a script at that point. So every time I was changing voices, it was a different person. The judge was the one who had the very low voice, whereas my normal voice was the regular one. What is this? Sigilif? When did it? Oh, okay. There was a coffee one that posted. I wonder why coffee doesn't post under Kel. I have to set that up. Oh well. I figure if anyone's going to do any advertising in there, it might as well be Kel. I just say I have been watching some lightning through my front window, but I haven't really been getting thunder, so I'm not too worried about a storm. Alright, let's see, I'm almost halfway through this book. Got one more story from Doyle, then it goes to another author again. I did not catch the Sigilif. Sigilif? Sigilif. Dock right up to. Okay, that's a weird way to say. Anyway. Oh, now Kel is posting the computer parts. Let's see. Let the ads come back. Oh, that's over? That'd have to be over. So normally Kel would post a message saying it's over. Oh well. Hopefully the ads are over. And then we can get on to another story. Okay. So our second Arthur Conan Doyle story I wonder, did he actually write the full book Round the Fire? Or at least compile his stories in it? That's what this one's from too. Like the stories in this book from Round the Fire have been like 2, 3, 5, and the next one's 9. Which makes it really interesting for me to do titles on the VODs. Anyway, our next story. Round the Fire. 9. The Story of the Jew's Breastplate. My particular friend, Ward Mortimer, was one of the best men of his day in everything connected with Oriental archaeology. He had written largely upon the subject, and he had lived for 2 years in a tomb at Thebes, while he had excavated the Valley of the Kings. And finally, he had created a considerable sensation by his exhumation of the alleged mummy of Cleopatra in her inner room at the Temple of Horus at Philae. With such a record at the age of 31, it was felt that a considerable career lay before him, and no one was surprised when he was elected to the curatorship of Belmore Street Museum, which carries with it a lectureship at the Oriental College and an income which has sunk with the fall of land, but which remains at the ideal sum which is large enough to encourage an investigator, and not so large as to venerate him. There was only one reason which made Ward Mortimer's position a little difficult at Belmore Street Museum, and that was the extreme eminence of the man whom he had to succeed. Professor Andreas was a profound scholar and a man of European reputation. His lectures were frequented by students from every part of the world, and his admirable management of the collection entrusted to his care was as commonplace as learned societies. There was, therefore, considerable surprise when, at the age of 55, he suddenly resigned his position and retired from those duties which had been both his livelihood and his pleasure. He and his daughter left a comfortable suite of rooms which had formed his official residence in connection with the museum, and my friend Mortimer, who was a bachelor, took up the quarters there. On hearing of Mortimer's appointments, Professor Andreas had written him a very kindly and flattering congratulatory letter. But I was actually present at the first meeting, and I went with Mortimer around the museum when the professor showed us the admirable collection which he had cherished so long. The professor's beautiful daughter and a young man, Captain Wilson, who was, as I understood, soon to be your husband, accompanied us in our inspection. There were 15 rooms in all, but the Babylonian, the Syrian, and the central hall, which contained the Jewish and Egyptian collection, were the finest of all. The Professor Andreas was a quiet, dry, elderly man with a clean-shaven face and an impassive manner, but his dark eyes sparkled and his features quickened into enthusiastic life as he pointed to us the rarity and the beauty of some of his specimens. His hand lingered so fondly over them that one could read his pride in them, and the grief in his heart now that they were passing from his care into that of another. He had shown us in turn his mummies, his papyri, his rare scarabs, his inscriptions, his Jewish relics, and his duplication of the famous 7-branched candlestick of the temple, which was brought to Rome by Titus, and which is supposed by some to be lying in the instant in the bed of the timber. When he approached the case, which stood in the very center of the hall, and he looked down through the glass with reverence in his attitude and manner. "This is no novelty to the expert like yourself, Mr. Mortimer," he said, "and I dare say that your friend, Mr. Jackson, will be interested to see it." Leaning over the case, I saw an object some 5 inches square, which consisted of 12 precious stones in a framework of gold, with golden hooks at 2 of the corners. The stones were all varying in sort of color, but they were of the same size. Their shapes, augment and gradation of tint made me think of a box of watercolor paints. Each stone had some hieroglyphic scratched on its surface. "You've heard, Mr. Jackson, of the Urim and the Thummim?" I had heard the term, but the idea of its meaning was exceedingly vague. "The Urim and the Thummim was a name given to the jeweled breastplate which lay upon the breast of the high priest of the Jews. They had a very special feeling of reverence of it, something of the feeling which an ancient Roman might have had for the syllabant books of the Capitol. There are, as you see, 12 magnificent stones inscribed with mystical characters. Counting them from left-hand top corner, the stones are carnelian, peridot, emerald, ruby, lapis lazuli, onyx, sapphire, agate, amethyst, topaz, beryl, and jasper." I was amazed at the variety and beauty of the stones. "Has the breastplate any particular history?" I asked. "It was a great age and of immense value," said Professor Andreas. "Without being able to make an absolute assertion, we have many reasons to think that it was possible that it may be the original Urim and Thummim of Solomon's temple. There is certainly nothing so fine in any collection in Europe. My friend Captain Wilson here is a practical authority upon precious stones, and he will tell you how pure these are." Captain Wilson, a man with a dark, hard, incisive face, was standing beside his fiancée at the other side of the crate. "Yes," he said certainly, "I have never seen finer stones. And the gold work is also worthy of attention. The ancients excelled in..." He was apparently about to indicate the setting of the stones when Captain Wilson interrupted him. "You'll see the finer example of the gold work in this candlestick," said he, turning to another table. And we all joined him in admiration of the embossed stem and delicately ornamented branches. Altogether, it was an interesting and to a novel experience to have the objects of such rarity explained by so great an expert, and when finally Professor Andreas finished our inspection by formally handing over the precious collection to my friend, I could not help pitying him and envying his successor, whose life was in the past and so pleasant a duty. Within a week, Ward Mortimer was duly installed in his new set of rooms and had become the autocrat of the Belmore Street Museum. After a fortnight afterwards, my friend gave a small dinner to half a dozen bachelor friends to celebrate his promotion. When his guests were departing, he pulled my sleeve and signaled to me that he wished for me to remain. "You have only a few hundred yards to go," said he, "and I was living in the chambers of Albany. You may as well stay and have a quiet cigar with me. I very much want your advice." I relapsed into an armchair and lit one of his excellent Matronas. When I returned from seeing the last of his guests out, he drew a letter from his dress jacket and sat down opposite to me. "This is an anonymous letter which I received this morning," he said. "I want just to read it to you and have your advice." "You're very welcome to it for what it's worth." This is how the note runs. "Sir, I should strongly advise you to keep a very careful watch over many valuable things which are committed to your charge. I do not think that a present system of a single watchman is sufficient. Be upon your guard, for an irreparable misfortune may occur." "Is that all?" 2 weeks is a fortnight. "Yes, that is all." "Well," said I, "it is at least obvious that it was written by one of the limited number of people who are aware that you have only one watchman at night." Lord Mortimer handed me the note with a curious smile. "Have you an eye for handwriting?" said he. "Now look at this." He put another letter in front of me. "Look at the C in congratulate, and the C in committed. Look at the capital I. Look at the trick of putting the dash instead of a stop. They're undoubtedly the same hand, with some attempt to disguise in case of the first one." "The second," said Lord Mortimer, "is a letter of congratulation which was written to me by the Professor Andreas upon obtaining the appointment." I stared at him in amazement. Then I turned over the letter in my hand, and there, sure enough, was Martin Andreas signed upon the other side. There could be no doubt in my mind of anyone who had the slightest knowledge of the science of graphology that the professor had written the anonymous letter warning his successor against thieves. It was inexplicable, but it was certain. "Why should he do it?" I asked. "Precisely what I should wish to ask you. If he had any such misgivings, why would he not come and tell me direct?" "Will you speak to him about it?" "There again I am in doubt. He might choose to deny that he wrote it." "At any rate," said I, "this warning is meant in a friendly spirit, and I should certainly act upon it. Are the present precautions enough to ensure you against robbery?" "I should have thought so. The public are only admitted from 10 till 5, and there is a guardian in every room. It stands the door between them, and so commands them both." "But at night?" "When the public are gone, we are at once put up with the great iron shutters, which are absolutely burglar-proof. The watchman is a capable fellow. He sits in the lodge, but he walks around every 3 hours. We keep one electric light burning in each room all night." "It is difficult to possess more, short of keeping your day watchers all night. We could not afford that." "At least I should communicate with the police and have a special constable put it outside in Belmore Street," said I. "As a letter, if the writer wishes to be anonymous, I would think he has the right to remain so. We should trust to the future to show some reason for the curious course which he has adopted." So we dismissed the subject, but all that night, after my return to my chambers, I was puzzling my brain as to what possible motive Professor Andreas could have for writing an anonymous letter warning to his successor. For that the writing was his was certain to me, but as to actually see him doing it. He foresaw some danger to the collection. Was it because he foresaw that it was the bandit in charge of it? But if so, why should he hesitate to warn Mortimer in his own name? I puzzled and puzzled, until at last I fell into a troubled sleep, which carried me beyond the usual hour of my rising. I was aroused in a singular and effective method, for about 9 o'clock my friend Mortimer rushed into my room with an expression of consternation upon his face. He was usually one of the most tidy men of my acquaintance, but now his collar was undone at the end, his tie was flying, and his hat was at the back of his head. I read his whole story in his frantic eyes. "The museum has been robbed," I cried, springing up in bed. "I fear so. Those jewels, the jewels of the Urim and Thummim." He gasped because he was out of breath from running. "I'm going to the police station. Come to the museum as soon as you can, Jackson. Goodbye." He rushed distractedly out of the room, and I heard him clatter down the stairs. It was not long until I was following his directions, and I found when I arrived that he had already returned with a police inspector and another elderly gentleman, who proved to be Mr. Purvis, one of the partners of Morrison and Company, the well-known diamond merchants. As an expert in stones, he was always prepared to advise the police. They were grouped around the case in which the breastplate of the jewel priest had been exposed. The plate had been taken out and laid upon the glass on top of the case. 3 heads were bent to open it. "It was obvious that it has been tampered with," said Mortimer. "It caught my eye the moment I passed through the room this morning. I examined it yesterday, and that it was certain that it was containing during the night." It was, as he said, obvious someone had been to work upon it. The settings in the uppermost row of the 4 stones, the carnelian, perdute, emerald, and ruby, were rough and jagged as if someone had scraped all around them. The stones were in their places, but the beautiful gold work, which had been admired only a few days ago, had been clumsily pulled about. "It looks to me," said the police inspector, "as if someone had been trying to take out the stones." "My fear is," said Mortimer, "that he not only tried but succeeded. I believe that these 4 stones were skillful imitations, which had been put in place of the originals." The same suspicion had evidently been brought to the mind of the expert, for he was carefully examining the 4 stones with the aid of a lens. He now submitted them to be several tests, and finally turned cheerfully to Mortimer. "I congratulate you, sir," he said heartily. "I will pledge my reputation that all 4 of these stones are genuine, and of the utmost unusual degree of purity." The color began to come back to my poor friend's frightened face, and he drew a long breath of relief. "Thank God! Then what in the world did the thief want?" "He probably meant to take the stones, but was interrupted." "In that case, one would expect him to take out 1 stone at a time, but then the setting of each of these would have been loosened, and yet the stones are still all here." "It is certainly most extraordinary," said the inspector. "I never remember a case like it. Let us see the watchman." The commissaire was called, and a soldierly, honest-faced man who seemed as concerned as Ward Mortimer at the inclement. "No, sir, I never heard a sound," he answered, in reply to the questions of the inspector. "I made my rounds 4 times as usual, but I saw nothing suspicious. I've been in my position 10 years, but nothing of this kind has ever happened before." "No thief could have come in through the windows?" "Oh, impossible, sir." "Or passed you at the door?" "No, sir, I never leave my post except when I walk my rounds." "What other openings are there to the museum?" "There's the door into Mr. Ward Mortimer's private rooms." "That is locked at night," my friend explained. "And in order to reach it, anyone from the street would have to open the outside door as well." "Your servants?" "Their quarters are entirely separate." Well, said the inspector. "This is certainly very obscure. However, there has been no harm done, according to Mr. Purvis." "I will swear that those stones are genuine." So that appears to be entirely one malicious damage. But nonetheless, I should be very glad to be careful around the premises and to see what we can find any trace of your visitor might have been. His investigation, which lasted all morning, was careful and intelligent, but it led to the end of nothing. He pointed out to us that there were two possible entrances to the museum which we had not considered. The one from the cellars by a trap door opening in the passage, and the other through a skylight from the lumber room overlooking the very chamber in which the intruder had penetrated. As neither the cellar nor the lumber room could be entered unless the thief was already within locked doors, the matter was not any practical importance, and the dust of the cellar and attic assured us that no one had used either one or the other. Finally, we ended as we began, without the slightest clue as to how, why, or by whom the setting of these 4 jewels had been tampered with. There remained one course for Mortimer to take, and he took it. Leaving the police to continue their fruitless researches, he asked me to accompany him that afternoon in a visit to Professor Andreas. He took with him the 2 letters, and it was intention to openly tax the predecessor with having written the anonymous warning, and to ask him to explain the fact that he should have anticipated so exactly as to what had occurred. The professor was living in a small villa in Upper Norwood, but we were informed by the servants that he was away from home. Seeing our disappointment, she asked us if we should like to see Mrs. Andreas, and showed us into a modest drawing room. I have mentioned incidentally that the professor's daughter was a very beautiful girl. She was a tall, blonde and graceful, with a skin as delicate tint which the French call matte, the color of old ivory or the lighter petals of a sulphur rose. I was shocked, however, as she entered to see the room, that she had changed so much in the last fortnight. Her young face was haggard, and her bright eyes heavy with trouble. "Father has gone to Scotland," she said. "He seems to be tired and has left a good deal to worry him. He only left us yesterday." "You look a little tired yourself, Miss Andreas," said my friend.
"I have been so anxious about Father."
"Can you give me a Scotch address?"
"Yes, he is with his brother, the Reverend David Andreas. I, Aranvilas Androsen."
Ward Mortimer made a note of the address, and we left without saying anything to the subject of our visit. We found ourselves in Belmore Street in the evening, in exactly the same position which we had left in the morning. Our only clue had been the professor's letter, and my friend had made up his mind to start for Androsen the next day, and to get to the bottom of the anonymous letter when a new development came to alter our plans. Very early upon the following morning, I was aroused from my sleep by a tap upon my bedroom door. There was a messenger with a note from Mortimer. "Do come around," it said. "The matter is becoming more and more extraordinary." When I obeyed his summons, I found him pacing excitedly up and down the central room, while the old soldier who guarded the premise stood with military stiffness in the corner. "My dear Jackson," he cried, "I am so delightful that you have come, for this is the most inexplicable business." "What has happened, then?" He waved his hand towards the case which contained the breastplate. "Look at it." I did so, and could not restrain a cry of surprise. The setting in the middle row of precious stones had been profaned in the same manner as the upper ones. Of the 12 jewels, 8 had now been tampered with in similar fashion. The setting of the lower 4 was neat and smooth, the others jagged and irregular. "Have the stones been altered?" I asked. "No, I am certain that the upper ones are the same the expert pronounced to be genuine. I observed yesterday that the little discoloration on the edge of the emerald. Since I have not extracted the upper stones, there is no reason to think the lowers have been transposed. What do you say? Have you heard anything, Simpson?" No, sir, the commissary answered. But when I made my round after daylight, I'd take a special look at the stones and saw at once that someone had been meddling with them. Then I called you, sir, and told you. I was backwards and forwards all night and never saw a soul or heard a sound. Come up and have some breakfast with me, said Mortimer, and he took me into his own chambers. Now, what do you think of this, Jackson? He asked. It is most objectless, futile, idiotic business that I've ever heard of. It can only be the work of a monomaniac. Can you put forward any theory? A curious idea came into my head. This object is a Jewish relic of great antiquity and sanctity, I said. How about the anti-Semitic movement? Could one conceive that a fanatic that way might find to desecrate? No, cried Mortimer. That will never do. Such a man might push his lunacy to the strength of destroying a Jewish relic, but why on earth should he nibble around every stone so carefully that he might only do 4 stones a night? We must have a better solution than that, and we must find it for ourselves. I do not think that our inspector is likely to help us. First of all, what do you think of Simpson, the porter? Have you any reason to suspect him? Only that he is the one person on the premises. But why should he indulge in such wanton destruction? Nothing's been taken. He has no motive. Mania? No, I swear to sanity. Have you any other theory? Well, yourself, for example. You are not a somnambulist by any chance. Nothing of the sort, I assure you. Then I give it up. But I don't, and I have a plan by which will make it all clear. To visit Professor Andreas? No, we shall find our solution nearer than Scotland. I will tell you what we shall do. You know that skylight which overlooks the central hall? We will leave the electric lights on in the hall, and we will keep watch from our lumber room, and you and I will solve the mystery for ourselves. If our mysterious visitor is doing 4 stones at a time, he still has 4 to do, and there's every reason to think that he will return tonight to complete the job. Excellent, I cried. We shall keep our own secret. Say nothing either to the police or to Simpson. Will you join me? With the utmost pleasure, said I, and so it was agreed. It was 10 o'clock at night when I returned to the Belmore Street Museum. Mortimer was, as I could see, in a state of suppressed nervous excitement, but it was still too early to begin our vigil, so we remained for an hour or so in his chambers, discussing all possibilities of a singular business which we had met to solve. At last, the roaring stream of hansom cabs and the rush of the hurrying feet became lower and more intermittent as the pleasure-seekers passed on their way to the stations and their homes. It was nearly 12 when Mortimer led the way to the lumber room, which overlooked the central hall of the museum. I had visited it during the day, and had spread some sacking so that we could lie with ease, and look straight down into the museum. The skylight was of unfrosted glass, but it was so covered with dust that it would be possible for anyone looking out from below to detect that he was overlooked. We cleared a small piece at each corner, which gave us a complete view of the room beneath us. In the cold white light of the electric lamps, everything stood out hard and clear, and I could see the smallest detail of the contents of the various cases. Such a vigil was an excellent lesson, since one has no chance but to look hard at those objects which we usually pass with such half-hearted interest. Through my little peephole I employed the hours in studying every specimen, from the huge mummy case which leaned against the wall to those very jewels which had brought us here, which gleamed and sparkled in the glass case immediately beneath us. There was such precious goldwork and many valuable stones scattered in the numerous cases, but those wonderful 12 which made up the Urim and Thummim glowed and burned with the radiance which far eclipsed the others. I studied in turn the tomb sculptures of Saqqara, the friezes of the Karnak, the statues of Memphis, and the inscriptions of Thebes, but my eyes would always come back to that wonderful Jewish relic, and my eyes to the singular mystery which surrounded it. I was lost in thought when my companion suddenly drew his breath sharply in and seized my arm in a compulsive grip. At the same instant I saw it which had excited him. I've said that against the wall, on the right-hand side of the doorway, the right-hand side as we looked at it, but the empty was left. The left was one entered. There stood a large mummy case. To an unutterable amazement, it was slowly opening. Gradually, the lid was swinging back, and the black slit which marked the opening was becoming wider and wider. So gently and carefully it was done that the movement was quite imperceptible. Then, as we breathlessly watched it, a white, thin hand appeared at the opening, pushing back the painted lid. Then another hand, and finally a face. A face which was familiar to us both. That of Professor Andreas. Stealthily he slunk out of the mummy case, like a fox stealing from its burrow, his head turning incessantly from left to right, stepping, then pausing, and stepping again, the very image of craft and caution. Once some sound in the street struck us motionless, and he stood listening, with his ear turned, ready to dart back to the shelter behind him. Then he crept onwards again on tiptoe, very, very softly and slowly, until he had reached the case in the center of the room. Then he took a bunch of keys from his pocket, unlocked the case, and took out the Jewish breastplate, and laying it upon the glass in front of him, began to work upon it with some sort of small glistening tool. He was so directly underneath us that he bent his head over the work, but we could guess from the movements of his hand that he was engaged in finishing the strange disfigurement which he had begun. I could realize from the heavy breathing of my companion and the twitchings of his hand, which still clutched my wrist, the furious indignation which filled his heart as he saw this vandalism in this very quarter of all others where he would least have expected it. He, the very man who a fortnight before had reverently bent over this unique relic, and who had impressed the antiquity and its sanctity upon us, was now engaged in this outrageous profanation. It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet there, in the white glare of the electric light beneath us, was that dark figure with the bent gray head and the twitching elbow. What inhuman hypocrisy, what hateful depth of malice against the sexer must underlie these sinister nocturnal labors? It was painful to think of and dreadful to watch. Even I, who had none of the acute feelings of a virtuoso, could not bear to look on and see this deliberate mutilation of so ancient a relic. It was a relief to me when my companion tugged at my sleeve as a signal that I was to follow him as he softly crept from the room. It was not until we were within his own quarters that he opened his lips, and then I saw by his agitated face how deep was his consternation. "The abominable Goth!" he cried. "Could you have believed it? It is amazing. He is a villain or a lunatic, one or the other. We shall be very soon which. Come with me, Jackson, and we shall get to the bottom of this black business." The door opened out of the passage from the private entrance to the rooms in the museum. This he opened softly with his key, having first kicked off his shoes, an example I followed. We crept together through the room until the large hall lay before us, with that dark figure still stooping and working at the central case. With an advance as cautious as his own, we closed in upon him, but softly as we went we could not take him entirely unawares. We were still a dozen yards from him when he looked around with a start, and uttering a husky cry of terror, he ran frantically down the museum. "Simpson! Simpson!" roared Mortimer, and still far away from the vista of the electric light doors, we saw the stiff figure of an old soldier suddenly appear. Professor Andreas saw him also and stopped running, with a gesture of despair. At the same instant, we each laid a hand upon his shoulder.
Yes, yes, gentlemen, he panted. I will come with you to your room, Mr. Ward Mortimer, if you please. I feel that I owe you an explanation.
My companion's indignation was so great that I could see that he dared not trust himself to reply. We walked on each side of the old professor, an astonished, accomplished commissaire bringing up the rear. When we reached the violeted case, Mortimer stopped and examined the breastplate. Already, one of the stones in the little row has had its seam turned back in the same manner as the others. My friend held up and glanced furiously at the professor. "How could you?" he cried. "How could you?"
It's horrible, horrible, said the professor. I don't wonder at your feelings. Take me to your room.
"But this should not be left exposed," cried Mortimer. He picked up the breastplate and carried it tenderly in his hand, while I walked beside the professor like a policeman with a malefactor. We passed into Mortimer's chambers, leaving the amazed old soldier to understand matters could be best. The professor sat down in Mortimer's armchair, and turned in so ghastly a color that for an instant all our resentment has changed into concern. A stiff glass of brandy brought him to life once more.
There, I'm better now, he said. These last few days have been too much for me. I am convinced that I could stand it no longer. It is a nightmare, a horrible nightmare, that I should be arrested for burglary in what has for long so been my museum. And yet, I cannot blame you. You could not have done otherwise. My hope always was that I should get it all over before I was detected. This would have been my last night's work.
"How did you get in?" asked Mortimer.
By taking a very great liberty with your private door. But the object justified it. The object justified everything. You will not be angry when you know everything. At least, you will not be angry with me. I had a key to your side door and also to the museum door. I did not give them up when I left. And so, you see, it was not difficult for me to let myself into the museum. I used to come in early before the crowd and cleared the streets. Then I hid myself in the mummy case and took refuge there wherever Simpson came round. I could always hear him coming. I used to leave in the same way as I came.
"You ran a risk."
I had to.
"But why? What on earth was your object? You, to do a thing like that?" Mortimer pointed reproachfully at the plate which lay before him on the table.
I could devise no other means. I thought and thought, but there was no alternative except a hideous public scandal and a private sorrow which would have clouded our lives. I acted for the best, incredible as I now seem to you, and I only ask your attention to enable me to prove it.
"I will hear what you have to say before I take any further steps," said Mortimer grimly.
I am determined to hold nothing back and to take you both completely into my confidence. I will leave it to your own generosity how far you will use the facts which I will supply you.
"We have the essential facts already."
And yet you understand nothing. Let me go back to what passed a few weeks ago, and I will make it clear to you. Believe me that what I say is the absolute and exact truth. You have met the person who calls himself Captain Wilson. I say he calls himself because I have no reason to believe that that is his correct name. It would take me too long if I were to describe all the means by which he obtained an introduction to me and ingratiated himself into his friendship and the affection of my daughter. He brought letters from foreign colleagues which compelled me to show him some attention, and then, by his own attainments, which are considerable, he succeeded in making himself a very welcome visitor at my rooms. When I learned that my daughter's affections had been gained by him, I may have thought it premature, but I certainly was not surprised, for he had a charm and manner of which conversation which would make him inconspicuous in society. He was much interested in Oriental antiquity, and his knowledge of the subject justified his interest. Often when he spent the evening with us, he would ask permission to go down to the museum and have an opportunity of privately inspecting the various specimens. You can imagine that I, as an enthusiast, was in sympathy with such a request, and that I felt no surprise at the constancy of his visits. After his actual engagement to Elise, there was hardly an evening which he did not pass with us, and an hour or two were generally devoted to the museum. He had the free run of the place, and when I have been away for the evening, I had no objection to his doing whatever he wished there. This state of things was only terminated by the fact of my resignation of my official duties and of my retirement to Norwood, where I hoped to have the leisure to write a considerable work which I had planned. It was immediately after this, within a week or so, that I first realized the true nature and character of the man whom I had so prudently introduced into my family. The discovery came to me through letters from my friends abroad, which showed me that his introductions to me had been forgeries. Aghast at the revelation, I asked myself to what motive this man could originally have had in practicing his elaborate deception on me. I was too poor a man for any fortune hunter to mark me down. Why, then, had he come? I remembered that some of the most precious gems in Europe had been under my charge, and I remembered also that the ingenious excuses by which this man had made himself familiar with the cases in which they were kept. He was a rascal who was planning some gigantic robbery. How could I, without striking my own daughter, who was infatuated with him, prevent him from carrying out any plan which he might have formed? My device was a clumsy one, and yet I could think of nothing more effective. If I had written a letter under my own name, you would naturally have turned to me for details which I wish not to give. I resorted to an anonymous letter begging you to be upon your guard. I may tell you that my charge from Belmore Street to Norwood had not affected the visits of this man, who had, I believe, a real and overpowering affection for my daughter. As to her, I could not have believed that any influence of a man as she was. Her stronger nature seemed to entirely dominate her. I had not realized how far this was in the case, or the extent of the confidence which existed between them, until that very evening when his true character for the first time was made clear to me. I had given orders that when he called he should be shown into my study instead of the drawing room. There I told him bluntly that I knew all about him, that I had taken steps to defeat his designs, and that I neither nor my daughter desired ever to see him again. I added that I thanked him, God, that I had found out before he had time to harm those precious objects which had been the work of my lifetime to protect. He was certainly a man of iron nerve. He took my remarks without a sign of either surprise or of defiance, but listened gravely and attentively until I had finished. Then he walked across the room, and without a word, and struck a bell.
"Ask Miss Andreas to be so kind as to step this way," he said to the servant.
My daughter entered. The man closed the door behind her. Then he took her hand in his. "Elise," he said, "your father has just discovered that I am a villain. He knows now what you knew before." She stood in silence, listening. "He says that we are to part forever," he said. She would not withdraw her hand. "Will you be true to me, or will you remove the last good influence which is ever likely to come into my life?" "John," she cried passionately, "I will never abandon you. Never, never. Not if the whole world were against you." In vain I argued and pleaded with her. It was absolutely useless. Her whole life was bound up in this man before me. My daughter, gentlemen, is all that I have left to love, and it filled me with agony when I was so powerless. I was powerless to save her from ruin. My hopelessness seemed to touch this man who was the cause of my trouble. "It may not be as bad as you think, sir," said he in his quiet and flexible way. "I love Elise with a love strong enough to rescue even one who has such a record as I have here. But it was yesterday that I promised that never again in my whole life would I do such a thing which she should be ashamed. I have made up my mind to do it, and never yet did I make up my mind to do a thing which I did not do." He spoke with an air which concealed conviction with it. As he concluded, he put his hand into his pocket and drew out a small cardboard box. "I am about to give you proof of my determination," said he. "This, Elise, shall be the first fruits of your redeeming influence over me. You are right, sir, in thinking I had hand and designs on the jewels in your possession. Such ventures have I had, charmed me, which depended as much upon the risk run upon the value of the prize. Those famous and antique stones in the Jewish priests were a challenge to my daring and ingenuity. I determined to get them." "I guessed as much." "There is only one thing that you did not guess." "And what is that?" "That I had got them. They're in this box." He opened the box and tilted out the contents upon the corner of my desk. My hair rose and my flesh grew cold as I looked. There were 12 magnificent square stones engraved with mystical characters. There was no doubt that they were the jewels from the Urim and Thummim. "Good God!" I cried. "How have you escaped discovery?" "By the substitution of 12 others, made especially to my order, in which originals were so carefully imitated that I defy the eye to detect the difference." "Then the present stones are false!" I cried. "They have been for some weeks." We all stood in silence, my daughter white with emotion but still holding this man by his hand. "You see what I am capable of, Elise," he said. "I see that you are capable of repentance and restitution," she answered. "Yes, thanks to your influence. I'll leave these stones in your hands, sir. Do what you like about it. But remember that whatever you do against me is done against the future husband of your only daughter. You'll hear from me soon, Elise. It is the last time I will ever cause pain to your tender heart." And with these words, he left both the room and the house. My position was a dreadful one. Here I was with these precious relics in my possession, and how could I return them without a scandal or an exposure? I knew the depth of my daughter's nature too well to suppose that I would ever be able to detach her from this man now that she had entirely given him her heart. I was not even sure how far it was right to detach her if she had such an ameliorating influence on him. How could I expose him without injuring her? And how far was I justified in exposing him when he had voluntarily put himself into my power? I thought and thought, until at last I formed the resolution which may seem to you to be a foolish one. And yet, if I had to do it again, I believe it would be the best course to open me. My idea was to return the stones without anyone being the wiser. With my keys, I could get into the museum at any time, and I was confident that I could avoid Simpson, for whose hours and methods were familiar to me. I determined to take no one into my confidence, not even my daughter, whom I told that I was about to visit my brother in Scotland. I wanted a free hand for a few nights, without injury as to my comings and goings. To this end, I took a room at the Harding Street that very night, with an intimation that I was a pressman, and that I should keep very late hours. That night I made my way into the museum, and I replaced 4 of the stones. It was hard work and took me all night. When Simpson came round, I always heard the footsteps and concealed myself in the mummy case. I had some knowledge of the gold work, but was far less skillful than the thief had been. He had replaced the fittings so exactly that I defy anyone to see the difference. My work was crude and clumsy. However, I hoped that the plate might not get carefully examined or the roughness of the settings observed until my task was done. The next night I replaced 4 more stones, and tonight I should have finished my task, and it had not been for the unfortunate circumstance which has caused me to reveal so much which I should have wished to keep concealed. I appeal to you, gentlemen, to your sense of honor and your compassion, whether what I have told you should go any further or not. My own happiness, my daughter's future, the hopes of this man's regeneration, all depend upon your decision.
Which is, said my friend, that all is well that ends well, and that the whole matter ends here and at once. Tomorrow those loose lettings will be tightened by an expert goldsmith, and so passes the greatest danger which, since the destruction of the temple, the Urim and Thummim have been exposed. Here is my hand, Professor Andreas, and I can only hope that under such difficult circumstances that I should have carried myself as unselfishly and as well. Just one footnote to this narrative. Within a month, Elise Andreas was married to a man whose name, as I have the indiscretion to mention it, would appeal to my readers as one who is now widely and deservedly honored. But if the truth were known, that honor is not due to him, but to the gentle girl who plucked him back when he had gone so far down the dark road along which few return. Okay, so I'm still live, but my computer decided to do a partial blue screen during that reading, which is why my model froze. And yet another reason why I need a better computer. But thank you all for coming in and listening to me fumble my way through 2 more swords. But now, let's see who might be on that we can raid. If you don't mind. Yes, I did hydrate. But honestly, the blue screens kill me. And we only have 4 more minutes until the ad, so let's see if we can find someone before then. Question is, do we want to raid someone else who is reading, which there are a couple. Let me try to pull up a better listing of them. Let's see, who is using Reading Fun tonight? Me and Black Dragon. Can't even say it. Black Dragon Tavern Gaming. It was doing 2 stories. Or what is Falco doing? Falco is reading Oz and doing ASMR stuff. So, what say those still remaining? Do we raid a friend? Do we raid other streamers? Or raid other readers? Because, you know, Dusk is streaming right now, too. I don't see any of the other... Oh. Never mind, we're in ads. Does anyone have a raid suggestion? Don't even have to redeem points for it, even though that's one of our redeems. Because honestly, I think I've given everyone a lot of redeem points just for the hell of it with me playing around. As said, looks like where's she? Falcor is the only other one that I see reading, at least doing ASMR anyway, on my list. Go ahead and raid Dusk. Up to R instead of E. Thank you, Oni. The Ultra Ball. Why did the blurb not play? Really? Or is this going to be extremely delayed? Anyway, adds in 17 seconds. Gonna go ahead and raid Dusk. So, I will see you all over there. If I can type this correctly. I hope you all have a great night and get some decent sleep. As the Lord knows, we all need more of that. Oh, I got the cost.